Imagine a world at the very peak of its power. The year is 1913. Humanity has conquered the globe with steam engines, telegraph cables, and international trade. Kings and emperors across Europe are cousins who vacation together on yachts. To the average person living in London, Berlin, or Paris, a massive, catastrophic war seems impossible. It would be financially suicidal, and frankly, civilized nations just don't do that anymore. Yet within a single year, this golden age would commit suicide. It wasn't an alien invasion or a natural disaster that broke the world. It was a sandwich, a wrong turn down a one-way street, and a teenage high school dropout with a pistol. Welcome to the complete history of World War I. Over the next few hours, we aren't just going to memorize dates and look at maps. We're going to explain how this happened. We will dig into the science behind the machine guns that froze the front lines, the biology of the diseases that thrived in the trenches, and the mechanics of the first tanks that crawled across the mud. We will travel from the snowy peaks of the Alps to the burning sand of the Middle East, uncovering how a local European dispute exploded into a global catastrophe. Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button so this history can reach more curious minds. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. The visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. So, fasten your seatbelts. We are going back to a sunny morning in June 1914 to a city called Sarajevo, where the world is about to change forever. To understand how the world broke, we first need to look at the map of Europe in 1914. If you looked at a map back then, you wouldn't see the dozens of countries we have today. You would see 5 or 6 massive blobs of colour. These were the great powers: the British Empire, the German Empire, the French Republic, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Russian Empire. Think of these empires like a group of very wealthy, very jealous neighbours living in a cul-de-sac. They are all armed to the teeth, and they are all paranoid that the guy next door is plotting to steal their lawn furniture. To feel safer, they invented a system called alliances. Now, without a background in political science, an alliance sounds complicated, but in 1914 it operated on the logic of a schoolyard fight. The idea was simple: deterrence. If Germany knows that punching Austria means they also have to fight Italy, Germany might think twice. By 1914, Europe had split into 2 major high school cliques. On one side, you had the Triple Entente: France, Britain, and Russia. On the other side, the Triple Alliance: Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. The theory was that these massive power blocks would balance each other out. No one would dare start a war because it would guarantee a 3 versus 3 brawl that no one could win. It was a mutually assured destruction system long before nuclear weapons existed. But there was a fatal flaw in this logic. This system meant that a small conflict between 2 tiny nations couldn't stay small. It was like rigging a house with explosives so that if a single window broke, the entire building would detonate. And the window was about to break in the Balkans. The Balkans is a region in southeast Europe. Think north of Greece. In 1914, this was the most unstable place on the continent. The Ottoman Empire, modern-day Turkey, was collapsing, and new, small nations like Serbia were rising up, full of nationalism and pride. Serbia wanted to unite all the Slavic people in the region. The problem? Millions of those Slavic people lived inside the borders of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Austria-Hungary was like an old, creaky mansion. It was huge, powerful, but holding together a dozen different ethnic groups that didn't necessarily like each other. The Austrian emperor viewed Serbia like a chaotic virus that could infect his empire and cause it to fall apart. So the tension was already at a breaking point. All it needed was a spark. That spark came on June 28, 1914, in Sarajevo, a city in Bosnia, which Austria had recently annexed. The Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austrian throne, decided to visit. Now, Franz Ferdinand wasn't the most popular guy. He was wealthy, prickly, and notoriously difficult. But he had a soft side. He loved his wife, Sophie. In the rigid Austrian court, Sophie was considered low birth and was often treated poorly. But in Sarajevo, away from the capital, Franz Ferdinand could have her ride in the car beside him with full honours. It was supposed to be a nice day out. But waiting for them in the crowd were 6 assassins. These weren't highly trained super spies like James Bond. They were teenagers, students, members of a group called Young Bosnia, supplied with weapons by a shadowy Serbian military society known as the Black Hand. They were amateurs. Most of them were suffering from tuberculosis, a fatal disease at the time, which made them willing to die for their cause because they were dying anyway. The plan was simple: throw a bomb at the Archduke's car. What happened next is a comedy of errors that led to the greatest tragedy in human history. The Archduke's motorcade was driving down the Appel Quay, a road along the river. The cars were open-topped convertibles, specifically a 1911 Greff and stiffed double phaeton. This is important because it offered zero protection. The first assassin lost his nerve and didn't act. The second assassin, a guy named Nedeljko Čebrinović, threw a hand grenade, but here is where physics and bad luck intervened. The grenade had a 10-second delay fuse. Čebrinović threw it, but it bounced off the folded-back convertible roof of the Archduke's car and rolled under the car behind them. Boom! The explosion injured about 20 people in the crowd and the following car, but Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were untouched. The assassin swallowed a cyanide pill and jumped into the river to kill himself. But the cyanide was expired. It just made him vomit, and the river was only 4 inches deep due to a hot summer. He was dragged out by the police and beaten up. At this point, a rational person would say, "Someone just threw a bomb at me. I should probably leave the city immediately." Franz Ferdinand was not a rational person. He was a stubborn royal. He was angry. He shouted at the mayor, "I come here as a guest and you greet me with bombs." After calming down at the town hall, Franz Ferdinand made a fateful decision. Instead of following the rest of the schedule, he wanted to go to the hospital to visit the officers injured by the bomb. A noble gesture. However, in the chaos, no one told the drivers the plan had changed. The lead car in the motorcade followed the original route. It turned right onto Franz Josef Street. The Archduke's driver, following the leader, also turned right. The governor of Bosnia, sitting in the Archduke's car, realized the mistake and yelled, "Stop! What are you doing? We're going the wrong way." The driver slammed on the brakes. Now, cars in 1914 didn't have synchronized gears or automatic transmissions. You couldn't just throw it in reverse. The driver had to stop, grind the gears, and slowly back up. The car stalled. It came to a dead stop right in front of a delicatessen called Schiller's. And standing right there, purely by coincidence, was Gavrilo Princip. Princip was one of the other assassins. After the bomb failed, he had wandered away, dejected. He thought the mission was a failure. He was just standing on the corner, perhaps getting a snack or just brooding, when suddenly the target of his assassination plot stopped 5 feet away from him. Princip didn't hesitate. He stepped up to the running board of the car. He pulled out an FN model 1910 pistol. This pistol is a piece of mechanical history. It's a semi-automatic .380 ACP caliber weapon, small, easily concealable, and reliable. He fired 2 shots. The first bullet passed through the car door and hit Sophie in the abdomen. The second bullet hit Franz Ferdinand in the neck, severing his jugular vein. The Archduke's last words were, "Sophie, Sophie, don't die! Live for our children!" By 11:30 a.m., both of them were dead. Now, in a sane world, this would be a police matter. Austria would demand Serbia arrest the conspirators. There would be a trial, maybe a hanging, and life would go on. But remember the schoolyard alliance system. Austria-Hungary didn't just want justice, they wanted to crush Serbia, but they were afraid of Serbia's big brother, Russia. So Austria called their own big brother, Germany. On July 5th, Germany issued what historians call the blank check. They told Austria, "You do whatever you need to do with Serbia, and we will support you 100% even if Russia gets involved." This was the fatal mistake. Germany thought Russia was too weak to fight. They thought the conflict would stay local. They were wrong. Empowered by Germany, Austria sent Serbia an ultimatum on July 23rd. This was a list of demands designed to be impossible to accept. It demanded that Austrian police be allowed to enter Serbia to investigate the crime of violation of national sovereignty. Amazingly, Serbia agreed to almost everything, but not everything. Austria rejected the answer. On July 28, 1914, exactly 1 month after the shooting, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Now the dominoes began to fall, driven by the rigid timetables of railway schedules and mobilization plans. July 29th, Russia, bound by honor and ethnic ties to protect Serbia, began to mobilize its massive army. Mobilization didn't mean war yet, but in 1914, moving millions of men and horses to the border took weeks. Once you hit the start button, you couldn't stop without leaving your country defenseless. August 1st, Germany, seeing Russia moving, declared war on Russia. August 3rd, Germany knew that France, Russia's ally, would attack them from the west. So, Germany didn't wait. They declared war on France. In just 1 week, a political assassination in a minor city had spiraled into a continental war. But there was one big player left on the sidelines, Great Britain. Britain wasn't technically forced to fight by their alliance. They were on the fence. The British public didn't care much about Serbia or Austria, but Germany had a problem. To fight France, they needed to get there fast. The French border was heavily fortified. The only way around was through a neutral country, Belgium. Germany demanded free passage through Belgium. Belgium, led by their courageous King Albert, said, "Belgium is a country, not a road." Germany invaded anyway. Britain had an old treaty dating back to 1839, promising to protect Belgium's neutrality. When German boots crossed the Belgian border, Britain issued an ultimatum: "Get out, or we are at war." Germany ignored it. On August 4th, 1914, Britain declared war on Germany. The dominoes had finished falling. The entire continent was now at war. But as the soldiers marched to the train stations, kissed their mothers and wives goodbye, and loaded their rifles, they were all smiling. Why? because of a dangerous delusion. Everyone, from the Kaiser in Berlin to the private in London, believed the same lie. We'll be home by Christmas. They had absolutely no idea what was waiting for them. August 1914 felt like a holiday. In Berlin, Paris, and London, crowds cheered as soldiers marched through the streets. Young men lied about their age to enlist, terrified that the war would be over before they got a chance to see action. The prevailing military theory of the time was the cult of the offensive. Generals believed that spirit, courage, and aggressive charges would win battles in days. They thought modern economies were too interconnected to sustain a long war. They were wrong. They were about to run headfirst into a conflict where technology had outpaced tactics by about 50 years. To understand why the war didn't end by Christmas, we have to look at the German master plan, the Schlieffen Plan. Named after Count Alfred von Schlieffen, this plan was Germany's answer to a geographic nightmare. Germany is stuck in the middle of Europe. To their west is France, to their east is Russia. Fighting both at the same time is a two-front war, a strategic death sentence. You have to split your army in half. So the Schlieffen Plan was designed to turn a two-front war into two one-front wars. The logic relied on speed and infrastructure. Germany knew Russia was huge, with terrible roads and a disorganized railway system. They estimated it would take Russia 6 weeks to mobilize their army. France, however, was modern and fast. The plan was a race against the clock. Throw almost everything at France immediately. Knock France out within 6 weeks, just like they did in 1870. Put everyone on trains and rush east to fight Russia before the Russian steamroller could get moving. But there was a problem. The border between France and Germany was heavily fortified. Attacking there would be like running into a brick wall. So Schlieffen designed a swinging door. Imagine a giant door hinged at Switzerland. The German army would act as the swinging edge, marching through neutral Belgium and the Netherlands, sweeping down into northern France, encircling Paris, and crushing the French army against the Swiss border. It was a brilliant plan on paper. In reality, it had 3 major flaws. First, the human element. The plan required soldiers to march 20 to 30 miles a day, every day, fighting battles in between. Humans aren't machines. By the time they reached France, the German soldiers were exhausted, their feet were bleeding, and they were outrunning their supply wagons. Horses, the main way of moving supplies, died by the thousands from exhaustion. Second, Belgium. Germany expected Belgium to just step aside. Instead, Belgium fought like hell. They blew up their own bridges and flooded their own fields. This slowed the Germans down just enough, days, not weeks, but in a schedule this tight, days mattered. Third, the British. The violation of Belgian neutrality brought the British Empire into the war. The British Expeditionary Force, BEF, was small, only about 100,000 men compared to millions of Germans, but they were highly trained professionals. At the Battle of Mons, their rifle fire was so fast and accurate that the Germans thought they were facing machine guns. They weren't. They were just facing men who could hit a target at 300 yards while under fire. Despite these hiccups, the German machine pushed forward. They pushed the French and British back mile by mile in what became known as the Great Retreat. By early September 1914, German patrols could see the Eiffel Tower in the distance. The French government fled Paris. It looked like the war really might be over. But then a mistake happened. The German First Army on the far right of the line turned early. Instead of sweeping around Paris to the west, they turned inside, exposing their flank, their side, to the French forces gathering in Paris. The French commander, General Joffre, saw the opportunity. He ordered a massive counterattack along the River Marne. This brings us to one of the most cinematic moments of early modern history, the taxis of the Marne. The French Sixth Army was attacking the exposed German flank, but they desperately needed reinforcements. 6,000 fresh troops were waiting in Paris, but the railways were clogged or destroyed. Trucks were scarce. General Gallieni, the military governor of Paris, had a crazy idea. He ordered the police to confiscate every taxi in the city. Imagine this, it's a Tuesday night in Paris. You are a taxi driver. Suddenly a police officer blows a whistle, stops you, kicks out your passenger, and tells you you work for the army now. About 600 Renault AG1 taxis were gathered at the Esplanade des Invalides. These weren't military vehicles, they were bright red and black, with small two-cylinder engines that topped out at 25 miles per hour. They were designed for short city trips, not convoy duty. Drivers were told to pack 5 soldiers into seats meant for 2 or 3. They drove in the dark without headlights, tailgating each other to stay together. It was a logistical nightmare. The convoy stretched for miles. Did it turn the tide of the war? Militarily, not really. 6,000 men in a battle involving millions is a drop in the bucket. But psychologically, it was massive. It proved that this was a total war. Everyone, from the taxi driver to the general, was part of the fight. And yes, in a very French twist, the taxi drivers actually kept their meters running. The French government later paid the fare, and about 70,000 francs in total. The reinforcements arrived. The Battle of the Marne raged for a week. The Allies stopped the German advance. The Schlieffen plan was dead. The Germans retreated to the River Aisne and did something that would define the next 4 years. They started digging. The German commander, realizing he couldn't break through, ordered his men to hold the high ground. To protect themselves from the murderous French artillery and British rifle fire, they dug holes. The Allies tried to go around them. They moved north. The Germans moved north to block them. This phase is called the Race to the Sea. Both sides tried to outflank the other, moving higher and higher up the map until they literally ran out of land at the North Sea coast of Belgium. Suddenly there was no way around. There was a solid line of soldiers stretching 475 miles from the Swiss border to the English Channel. Since you couldn't go around and you couldn't go through without dying, you had to go down. This is the birth of trench warfare. And we need to explain the engineering here, because digging a hole sounds simple, but it's actually a complex survival system. If you are a soldier in an open field in 1914, you are dead. Machine guns and shrapnel don't care about your bravery. The earth is your only armor, but you can't just dig a straight ditch. If an enemy soldier jumps into a straight trench with a machine gun, he can fire down the entire line and kill everyone. Or if an artillery shell lands in a straight trench, the blast wave and shrapnel will travel down the corridor like a cannonball. So they introduced the traverse system. Trenches were dug in a zigzag or square-tooth pattern. You would dig 10 yards, turn right, dig a few yards, turn left, and so on. This meant that if a shell landed in your section, the blast was contained by the dirt walls. It also meant an enemy could only shoot at the men in that specific traverse. Soon, these weren't just holes, they were underground cities. The parapet, the front wall of the trench, reinforced with sandbags, millions of them. The fire step, a ledge cut into the dirt so a soldier could step up, shoot over the top, and then step down to safety. Duckboards, wooden planks laid on the floor. Without them, soldiers would sink into the mud, a substance we will talk about later, which was often as deadly as bullets. Wire. Miles of barbed wire were strung out in front of the trenches. This wasn't just to cut people, it was to slow them down. If you get caught in the wire, you are a stationary target, and a stationary target is a dead target. Between the two lines of trenches lay no man's land. This strip of land, varying from a few hundred yards to just 50 feet wide, was a cratered, blasted hellscape. It was the killing zone. By the winter of 1914, the illusion of the short war was shattered. The movement had stopped, the maps were frozen. Millions of men were now living in the dirt, staring at the enemy across a field of mud, waiting for orders that would send them over the top. The age of the cavalry charge was over. The age of industrial slaughter had begun. If the trenches were the stage, then the weapons were the actors. And in 1914, the cast of characters had changed dramatically. For centuries, war had been a matter of line of sight. You saw the enemy, you aimed your musket or cannon, and you fired. But the Industrial Revolution had been quietly working in the background, perfecting the science of thermodynamics, metallurgy, and chemistry. By the time the nations of Europe marched to war, they weren't just bringing guns, they were bringing machines designed to mass-produce death. To understand why the casualty lists were so horrifyingly long, 60,000 casualties in a single day at the Somme, for instance, we have to look at the engineering, the machine gun, the industrial reaper. The defining sound of World War I was the rat-a-tat-tat of the machine gun, specifically the Maxim gun and its derivatives, the British Vickers, the German MG-08. Before this, Gatling guns existed, but they were hand-cranked. If the soldier panicked and cranked too fast, the gun jammed. Hiram Maxim, an American inventor, changed everything with a simple observation. When a rifle is fired, it kicks back. That kick is wasted energy. Maxim built a gun that used that recoil energy to eject the empty shell, load a new cartridge, and fire again. As long as you held the trigger, the gun became a fully automatic, self-sustaining heat engine. But here is the physics problem: friction and heat. When you fire a bullet, the explosion generates massive heat. In a bolt-action rifle, this isn't a huge deal because you fire slowly, but a machine gun fires 500 to 600 rounds per minute. That kind of friction generates enough heat to turn a steel barrel white-hot in seconds. If the metal gets too soft, the barrel warps, the rifling melts, and the bullets start tumbling sideways. Or worse, the round cooks off, explodes, in the chamber before you pull the trigger. The solution was water cooling. If you look at photos of WWI machine guns, they look thick and heavy. That's because the barrel is surrounded by a water jacket, a steel casing filled with about 7 to 10 pints of water. As the gun fires, the water absorbs the heat. When the water hits 212 degrees Fahrenheit, 100 degrees Celsius, it boils. This creates steam. Now you have a pressure cooker. If you don't vent the steam, the jacket explodes. So they added a condensing tube, a rubber hose leading from the front of the gun into a metal can of water. The steam travels down the hose, condenses back into water, and can be reused. This system was so effective that a British Vickers gun team once fired continuously for 12 hours. They fired nearly 1 million rounds. They went through 100 barrels and used all the local water, eventually resorting to soldiers urinating into the water jackets to keep the guns cool. Tactically, these guns changed geometry. Soldiers didn't aim at individuals, they aimed at space. They set up interlocking fields of fire. Imagine two invisible triangles overlapping in front of the trench. Anything that entered those triangles, man, horse, or vehicle, was destroyed. They created a beaten zone, an area where bullets were landing so thickly that survival was statistically impossible. Artillery, the king of battle. While machine guns froze the front lines, artillery did the killing. Roughly 60% of all casualties in WWI were caused by artillery, but we need to clarify a common misconception. When we say artillery, we aren't just talking about big cannonballs hitting the ground and exploding, we are talking about shrapnel, Getty images. The shrapnel shell, named after Henry Shrapnel, is essentially a flying shotgun. It is designed to kill troops in the open. Here is the mechanics of a shrapnel shell. The case, a hollow steel projectile. The payload, inside it is packed with hundreds of lead balls, bullets, usually suspended in a resin matrix. The charge, a small explosive charge, is at the base of the shell behind the balls. The fuse, this is the critical part. It's a timer nose fuse. Before firing, the artillery crew sets the timer based on the distance to the target. Let's say the enemy trench is 3 miles away. The math says the shell will take 12 seconds to get there. They set the fuse for 11.8 seconds. The gun fires. The shell arcs through the sky. Just before it hits the ground, ideally about 30 feet in the air, the timer runs out. The fuse ignites the charge at the back of the shell. This doesn't blow the shell apart. It shoots the lead balls forward out of the nose of the shell, adding the velocity of the explosion to the velocity of the flying shell. The result is a cone of high-velocity lead rain plunging downward. If you are a soldier lying flat on the ground to avoid machine gun fire, shrapnel is designed to get you. The only protection is overhead cover, hence the dugout. However, shrapnel was useless against barbed wire and concrete bunkers. For that, they needed high-explosive HE shells. HE shells work on a different principle, overpressure. When TNT detonates, it turns a solid into a gas almost instantly. This expansion creates a shock wave that moves faster than the speed of sound. If an HE shell lands near you, you don't need to be hit by a fragment to die. The shock wave hits your body. Your body is mostly water, which is incompressible, but your lungs and intestines are filled with air. The pressure wave compresses these air pockets violently, rupturing your lungs from the inside. Soldiers were often found dead in trenches without a scratch on them, killed purely by the physics of the blast wave. Chemical warfare. The devil's chemistry. Set. By 1915, the war was a stalemate. The machine guns and artillery had created a deadlock. The German High Command turned to their scientists, specifically a man named Fritz Haber, to find a way to break the lines. Haber's solution was chlorine gas. The first major attack happened at the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915. German troops hauled thousands of steel cylinders to the front line, waited for the wind to blow toward the French and Canadian lines, and opened the valves. Chlorine is a diatomic gas, Cl2. It is greenish-yellow and heavier than air. This heavier-than-air property is crucial. It doesn't float away, it sinks, it flows into the trenches, into the dugouts, and into the craters where soldiers are hiding. When a soldier breathes in chlorine, a simple but horrific chemical reaction takes place. The human lung is moist. Water, H2O, is present on the surface of the alveoli, air sacs. When chlorine meets water, it reacts. Cl2 plus H, 2CO, yields HCl plus HO. ClH. Cl is hydrochloric acid. HOCl is hypochlorous acid. Essentially, the gas turns into acid inside the soldier's lungs. The acid dissolves the lung tissue. The body responds by flooding the lungs with fluid to wash away the irritant. The result is that the soldier drowns on dry land, frothing at the mouth with pink, bloody foam. It is a slow, agonizing death. But chemistry is an arms race. The Allies realized that since chlorine is acidic, a base would neutralize it. The first improvised gas masks were cotton pads soaked in urine, which contains ammonia and urea bases. Later, activated charcoal filters were developed to scrub the air. So the chemists escalated. They introduced phosgene, which was invisible and smelled like moldy hay, making it harder to detect. And finally, the king of gases, mustard gas. Mustard gas, Iperite, isn't actually a gas. It's an oily liquid that is aerosolized into a fine mist by an exploding shell. Mustard gas is a vesicant, a blistering agent. It attacks the DNA of the cells. Unlike chlorine, you don't need to breathe it for it to hurt you. If it touches your skin, it passes through your uniform and burns. But it's insidious because there is a latency period. A soldier might survive a mustard gas attack feeling fine, but 12 to 24 hours later, his skin starts to itch. Then, massive yellow blisters filled with fluid form all over his body, especially in moist areas like the armpits and groin. His eyes swell shut, leading to temporary or permanent blindness. If he inhaled it, the lining of his bronchial tubes essentially sloughs off. Mustard gas didn't kill as many people as bullets. Only about 2 to 3% of those affected died, but it required massive resources to treat the wounded. A wounded man takes up a hospital bed, requires nurses, and lowers morale more than a dead man. This was the terrifying reality of WWI weaponry. It wasn't about skill or honor or courage. It was about engineering. It was a war where a man with a PhD in chemistry could kill 1,000 men from miles away without ever seeing their faces. If you survived the machine guns, the shrapnel, and the gas, you still had to survive the trench itself. We often think of World War I as a series of battles, but for the average soldier, 90% of the time was spent simply waiting. And while they waited, they lived in an environment that was actively trying to kill them. The trench wasn't just a defensive position, it was a biological hazard. It was a ditch dug into the water table of northern France and Flanders, regions known for being below sea level. When you dig down 6 feet in Flanders, you don't hit dry earth, you hit water. This brings us to the first non-combat enemy, the mud. WWI mud wasn't just wet dirt. It was a thick, clay-like substance that acted like quicksand. It had a suction force strong enough to pull the boots off a man's feet. There are recorded accounts of men falling off the duckboards, the wooden planks at the bottom of the trench, and drowning in the mud because their comrades couldn't pull them out in time. But the mud did something even more insidious to the human body. It created a medical condition known as trench foot. To understand trench foot, we have to look at human physiology. Your body is a heat engine. It needs to maintain a core temperature of roughly 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, 37 degrees Celsius. When your extremities, like your feet, get cold and wet, your body enters survival mode. The brain sends a signal to the blood vessels in your feet to constrict, tighten up. This is called vasoconstriction. The goal is to reduce blood flow to the skin so that the blood stays in the core to keep your heart and lungs warm. This works fine for a few hours, but in the trenches, soldiers stood in freezing water for days, sometimes weeks, without changing their socks or boots. Because the blood vessels remain constricted for so long, the tissue in the feet stops getting oxygen and nutrients. The cells begin to suffocate. Toxic waste products from cellular metabolism build up because the blood isn't there to wash them away. Here is the medical progression. Stage 1. The foot goes numb and turns red or blue. It feels cold to the touch. Stage 2. The foot swells enormously. When the soldier finally takes his boot off, the foot might be 2 or 3 times its normal size. Stage 3, blisters form. Not normal friction blisters, but massive pockets of fluid caused by cell walls breaking down. Stage 4, necrosis. The tissue dies and turns black. This is gangrene. Once gangrene sets in, there is no cure but amputation. If you don't cut the foot off, the infection enters the bloodstream, sepsis, and kills the soldier. The British Army eventually realized this was a logistics problem, not just a medical one. They issued an order: every soldier must have 3 pairs of socks, 1 on his feet, 1 in his pack, and 1 drying under his armpits, using body heat to dry the wool. They also issued tons of whale oil. Soldiers were ordered to rub this thick, smelly grease onto each other's feet to create a waterproof barrier. It was mandatory. An officer would inspect feet daily. But while the mud attacked from below, another enemy attacked from within the uniform: lice. These weren't just an annoyance, they were a plague. The cootie or body louse, Pediculus humanus, thrived in the seams of dirty clothing. A single female louse could lay hundreds of eggs a week. Soldiers would spend their free time chatting, a slang term for sitting in a circle, taking their shirts off, and popping the lice between their fingernails. The popping sound was like a chatty conversation, but lice were vectors for disease. Specifically, trench fever. For a long time, doctors were baffled. Soldiers would suddenly spike a high fever, suffer terrible pain in their shins, shin splints, and be incapacitated for weeks. It wasn't fatal, but it took men off the line. It wasn't until later that science found the culprit, a bacterium called Bartonella quintana. Here is the gross mechanism. The louse bites the soldier to drink blood. The louse then defecates on the soldier's skin. The louse poop is full of bacteria. The bite itches. The soldier scratches the bite. By scratching, he literally rubs the infected poop into the open wound. Shutterstock, calm far. And then there were the rats. If you leave millions of pounds of food, scraps and unburied bodies in a confined space, nature provides a scavenger. The trench rat wasn't your average city rat. These were brown rats, and they grew to the size of small cats. Soldiers told horror stories of rats that were so bold they would try to steal food out of a sleeping man's hand. But the psychological horror came from what the rats ate when the food ran out. They ate the dead. A soldier might look over the parapet and see a rat gnawing on the face of a fallen comrade. It was a daily reminder of their own mortality, that to nature they were just meat. This constant exposure to death, noise, and helplessness led to the most misunderstood injury of the war: shell shock. In 1914, military doctors didn't understand trauma. If a man stopped fighting, shook uncontrollably, or went mute, he was often branded a coward. He might be court-martialed and even executed for lack of moral fiber. Today, we know this as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, but shell shock was a specific manifestation of the concussive nature of WWI. It was a physical and psychological overload of the nervous system. The physical component. When a high explosive shell detonates, it creates a blast wave of pressure. Even if the shrapnel misses you, that pressure wave hits your brain. Modern neurology suggests that these micro-concussions cause tiny lesions on the brain tissue, similar to what we see in NFL players, CTE, today. The psychological component. The human brain has a fight or flight mechanism. When danger appears, your amygdala dumps adrenaline into your blood, your heart races, your muscles tense, you are ready to run or fight. But in a trench, you cannot run, you'll be shot for desertion, and you cannot fight. The enemy is miles away, firing artillery. So all that chemical energy is trapped. The nervous system shorts out. The symptoms were bizarre and terrifying. Men would go blind, yet their eyes were physically perfect, hysterical blindness. They would lose the ability to walk. They would develop a distinctive, jerky walk called the trench walk. And then there was the 1,000-yard stare, a look of total emotional detachment where the eyes seemed to focus on something infinitely far away. Treatment varied from the barbaric electric shocks to snap them out of it, to the sympathetic, the talking cure, pioneered by doctors like W.H.R. Rivers, which laid the groundwork for modern therapy. Yet amidst this biological and psychological hell, there was one moment of light, a moment that proves humanity can exist, even in the darkest places. The Christmas Truce of 1914. By December 1914, the war was only 5 months old. The hatred hadn't fully calcified yet. The propaganda machine hadn't yet convinced everyone that the enemy was a monster. On Christmas Eve, near Ypres, Belgium, British soldiers heard something strange drifting across no man's land. It wasn't gunfire, it was singing. The Germans were singing Stille Nacht, Silent Night. They were placing small Christmas trees with lit candles on the parapets of their trenches. The British listened, then they sang back. The first knoll. Slowly, tentatively, heads popped up above the trenches. No one fired. A German soldier shouted in broken English, "You know shoot, we know shoot." Men climbed out of the mud. They walked into the killing zone of no man's land. They didn't bring rifles, they brought gifts. It sounds like a myth, but we have the letters and photos to prove it. Germans gave sausages and cigars. British gave plum pudding and buttons from their uniforms. They showed each other photos of their wives and children. They realized that the monster across the field was just a guy named Hans who worked in a bakery in Berlin and wanted to go home just as much as John from Manchester did. Did they play football? Yes and no. The story of a singular, organized match with a referee is likely a myth. But there were kickabouts. Someone produced a ball or a tin can, and hundreds of men chased it around the frozen mud. For a few hours, the war stopped, not because generals ordered it, but because the soldiers decided they didn't want to kill each other on Christmas. But the truce was fragile. In some sectors, it never happened. In others, officers threatened to shoot anyone who fraternized. By Boxing Day, the artillery started up again. The men who had shaken hands on Christmas aimed their rifles and went back to the business of killing. It never happened again on that scale. By 1915, poison gas and deeper hatred made such a truce impossible. But for one frozen night in 1914, the human spirit defeated the machine of war. While the Western Front was locked in a muddy stalemate, the war was exploding across the rest of the globe. It is called a world war for a reason. If the Western Front was a knife fight in a phone booth, claustrophobic and static, the war elsewhere was a sprawling, chaotic adventure across deserts, oceans, and frozen peaks. Let's start by looking east. The Eastern Front, the War of Movement. If you look at a map of the Western Front, France/Belgium, the line of trenches was about 450 miles long. It was dense. You had millions of men packed into a relatively small space. There was nowhere to go but forward. Now, look at the Eastern Front. It stretched over 1,000 miles from the Baltic Sea in the north down to the Black Sea in the south. The geography here dictated a completely different kind of war. Because the front was so massive, neither the Germans nor the Russians had enough men to dig a solid line of trenches from end to end. There were gaps, huge gaps. This meant that maneuver warfare was still possible. In the West, if you tried to flank the enemy, you hit the sea or the Swiss Alps. In the East, if you flanked the enemy, you just kept going into the endless Russian steppes. Armies could move 50 or 100 miles in a few weeks. They could surround entire armies. The most brutal example of this was the Battle of Tannenberg in August 1914. The Russian army was massive, the Russian steamroller. But it had a fatal technical flaw: communication. In 1914, radio, wireless telegraphy, was new. The Russians didn't have enough wire to lay telephone lines, so they used radios, but they didn't have enough code books to encrypt their messages. So, Russian generals were broadcasting their exact locations and plans in the clear, plain language over the airwaves. The Germans, sitting in their radio towers, simply wrote down what the Russians were doing. Using this intelligence, the German Eighth Army, led by Generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff, performed a classic double envelopment. They let the Russian center push forward, then pinched the sides. They encircled the Russian Second Army. The result was a slaughter. 92,000 Russian soldiers were captured. Another 78,000 were killed or wounded. The Russian commander, General Samsonov, realized he had lost an entire army in 3 days. Ashamed to report to the Tsar, he walked into the woods and shot himself. This battle set the tone for the East. Massive movements, massive encirclements, and casualties on a scale that dwarfed the West. But while the Germans had the tactics, the Russians had the numbers, the East became a seesaw of death that would eventually break the Russian Empire. Gallipoli, the amphibious nightmare. By 1915, the Allies were desperate to break the deadlock. Winston Churchill, then the First Lord of the Admiralty, had a bold idea. If we can't break through the front door, Germany, let's kick in the back door. The back door was the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, Germany's ally. The plan was to sail a fleet through the Dardanelles Strait, capture Constantinople, Istanbul, and open a supply line to Russia. But first, they had to capture the peninsula guarding the strait, Gallipoli. Getty Images. This brings us to one of the most difficult engineering challenges in warfare: the amphibious assault. In World War II, think D-Day, soldiers had specialized landing craft with ramps that dropped down. In 1915, those didn't exist. So, how do you get 70,000 men from a ship to a beach while people are shooting at you? You use rowboats, specifically wooden whaleboats towed by small steam pinnaces. On April 25, 1915, British, French and Anzac, Australian and New Zealand Army Corps troops tried to land. The physics of a beach landing are terrifying. Water slows you down, sand slows you down, and because you are at sea level, the enemy on the cliffs above has a perfect trajectory. At V Beach, the British tried a Trojan horse experiment. They took an old coal ship, the SS River Clyde, cut holes in its sides, and ran it aground. The plan was for soldiers to run out of the holes along a gangplank and onto the beach. It was a disaster. The gangplank was too short. Soldiers jumped into deep water and drowned under the weight of their packs, 60 to 80 pounds. Those who made it to the gangplank were packed together like sardines. Ottoman machine gunners on the cliffs simply swept the gangplank. The sea literally turned red with blood. Meanwhile, at Anzac Cove, the Australians and New Zealanders landed at the wrong spot. Instead of a flat beach, they faced steep, crumbling cliffs and ravines covered in thorny scrub. They managed to claw their way up, but they couldn't push inland. The Ottomans, led by a brilliant commander named Mustafa Kemal, later Ataturk, held the high ground. He told his men, "I do not order you to fight, I order you to die. In the time it takes us to die, other troops and commanders can come and take our places." The result was trench warfare on a cliff. The conditions were arguably worse than in France. Heat. It was 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 38 degrees Celsius, in the summer. Flies, millions of them, breeding on the rotting corpses in no man's land, which was sometimes only 10 yards wide. The flies spread dysentery. Men were so weak from diarrhea they couldn't lift their rifles. Water. Every drop had to be shipped in. After 8 months and 250,000 Allied casualties, the campaign was a failure. But the evacuation was a masterpiece of deception. They needed to sneak 80,000 men off the beach without the Ottomans noticing. If the Ottomans realized they were leaving, they would charge and slaughter them on the boats. So they invented the drip rifle. This was a Rube Goldberg machine of death. A rifle was set up on the trench parapet. A string was tied to the trigger. The other end of the string was tied to a tin can. Above the can was another tin filled with water, leaking through a tiny hole. As the water dripped into the lower can, it got heavier. Eventually, the weight pulled the string, and bang, the rifle fired. These ghost guns fired intermittently all night long, convincing the Ottomans that the trenches were still full, while the last boat silently slipped away into the darkness. It was the only successful part of the entire Gallipoli campaign. The Alpine front, the war in ice. While the British were baking in Turkey, the Italians were freezing in the Alps. In May 1915, Italy joined the Allies, hoping to seize territory from Austria-Hungary. The border between them ran through the Dolomites and the Julian Alps. This was mountain warfare, and it defied physics. Usually in war, you want the high ground. Here, the high ground was 10,000 feet, 3,000 meters up. Soldiers had to haul heavy artillery pieces, weighing tons, up vertical rock faces. To do this, they built a system of cable cars, teleferice, and carved paths into the sheer cliffs known as via ferrata, iron paths. These are still used by climbers today. But the environment was the real killer. The cold temperatures dropped to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 30 degrees Celsius. If a soldier touched his rifle barrel with a bare hand, his skin would freeze to the metal instantly. The White Death. Avalanches. In December 1916, a massive snowfall occurred. Both sides realized they could weaponize the weather. Austrian artillery spotters would watch for Italian movements below a snowpack. They would fire a single, high explosive shell into the snowbank above. The explosion would trigger a fracture in the snow slab. Gravity did the rest. Millions of tons of snow moving at 80 miles per hour would bury entire battalions alive. It is estimated that 60,000 soldiers died in avalanches during the war, more than in many major battles. The tunnels. Since they couldn't go over the peaks, too exposed, they went through them. Both sides employed engineers to drill tunnels through solid glacial ice and granite. They built barracks, power stations, and supply depots inside the glaciers. It was like an ant colony carved into an iceberg. The ultimate goal of tunneling was mines. The Italians would tunnel underneath an Austrian mountain peak. They would pack the tunnel with 50 tons of blasting gelatin, a stronger version of dynamite. On April 17, 1916, the Italians detonated a mine under the Col di Lana. Boom! The entire top of the mountain was blown off. The explosion was so loud it was reportedly heard in Venice. The Austrian garrison on top simply ceased to exist. This was the White War. It was a war where you could be killed by a sniper, a shell, a rockfall, an avalanche, or simply by freezing to death in your sleep. From the burning sands of Gallipoli to the frozen peaks of the Alps, the war had engulfed every possible environment. But back in France, the generals were still looking for a way to break the deadlock. And in 1916, they decided that the answer was simply to kill so many people that the enemy ran out of men first. They called it attrition. The soldiers called it the meat grinder. By 1916, the war had become a mathematical equation. The romantic notion of a swift victory was dead. The generals on both sides looked at the maps, saw the solid lines of trenches stretching from Switzerland to the sea, and realized they couldn't go around, so they decided to go through. But this wasn't about taking territory anymore. The German Chief of General Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, came to a grim conclusion. He believed that the Allies, specifically France, were close to breaking point. He didn't need to capture Paris, he just needed to kill enough Frenchmen that the country would collapse from grief and exhaustion. He called this strategy attrition. His goal was, in his own words, to bleed France white. To do this, he needed a trap, a place so important to the French national identity that they would never retreat no matter the cost. He chose Verdun, the anvil. Verdun was a historic fortress city on the Meuse River. To the French, it was their Alamo. Losing it was unacceptable. Falkenhayn knew this. He planned to attack Verdun, not to take it, but to draw the entire French army into a kill zone where his artillery could pulverize them. On February 21st, 1916, the Germans launched the attack with a bombardment that defies imagination. In the first 10 hours, they fired 1 million shells. The physics of this bombardment changed the landscape itself. The hills around Verdun were literally lowered by several meters because the explosions churned the earth so violently. Forests were reduced to splinters. The French were desperate. They had only one road leading into Verdun to supply the entire army. The D75 road, later renamed La Voie Sacrée, the Sacred Way. Here we see a miracle of logistics. To keep the army alive, a truck had to pass every 14 seconds, 24 hours a day for months. The vehicles, 3,000 trucks, Berliet and Renault. The maintenance, if a truck broke down, it was immediately pushed into the ditch to keep the line moving. The road surface, the road was soft limestone. The heavy trucks ground it to dust. So an army of territorial troops stood on the sides, shoveling crushed stone under the wheels while the trucks were moving. For 300 days and nights the battle raged. It was an industrial slaughterhouse. Men didn't fight in units. They fought in small groups, huddled in shell craters filled with green, chemical water. When it finally ended in December 1916, the front lines had barely moved. The cost? Over 700,000 casualties combined. Falkenhayn's exchange rate failed. The Germans bled just as much as the French. The hammer, the Somme. To relieve the pressure on Verdun, the British launched their own massive offensive further north, along the river Somme. This was the big push. The British commander, General Douglas Haig, believed that with enough artillery, he could simply blow a hole in the German lines and walk through. The plan relied on a simple premise: artillery conquers, infantry occupies. For 7 days leading up to the attack, the British fired 1.5 million shells at the German trenches. The noise was heard in London, over 150 miles away. The objective was twofold: kill the Germans in their dugouts, cut the barbed wire in front of the trenches, but here physics and engineering failed them. The wire problem: the British used mostly shrapnel shells, the ones filled with lead balls we discussed earlier. Shrapnel is designed to kill people. Against barbed wire, which is made of flexible, tempered steel, shrapnel is useless. The lead balls simply pinged off the wire, or worse, tangled it up even more. To cut wire, you need high explosive, HE, shells to blast the earth underneath the stakes, but the British didn't have enough of those. The fuse problem. British manufacturing was rushing to produce millions of shells. Quality control slipped. It is estimated that 30% of the shells were duds. They didn't explode. Even today, French farmers plough up tons of unexploded iron every year, the iron harvest. The dugout problem. The Germans knew the attack was coming. They had dug deep, really deep. Some German dugouts were 30 to 40 feet underground, reinforced with concrete and electricity. When the bombardment started, they just played cards and waited. When the shelling stopped, they knew the infantry was coming. They ran up the stairs and manned their machine guns. July 1st, 1916. At 7:30 a.m., the whistles blew. Over 100,000 British soldiers climbed out of their trenches. They were ordered to walk. This seems insane to us now. Why walk into machine gun fire? The logic was communication. In 1916, once a soldier left the trench, the general lost control. There were no portable radios. To keep the men organized and moving together behind the creeping barrage, a wall of artillery fire that moved forward ahead of them, they had to move at a steady pace. But the barrage had moved on too fast. The wire wasn't cut. The Germans were alive. The result was a massacre. The British troops bunched up at the gaps in the wire. The German machine gunners simply traversed their guns back and forth. By sunset, 19,240 British soldiers were dead. Another 38,000 were wounded. It remains the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army. The Battle of the Somme dragged on for 4 months. By November, the Allies had advanced only about 6 miles. But something happened in September that would change warfare forever. The arrival of the tank. The stalemate proved one thing: flesh and blood cannot defeat machine guns and barbed wire. The solution had to be mechanical. Enter the landship. To maintain secrecy during development, the British told the factory workers they were building mobile water tanks for the desert campaign. The name stuck. We still call them tanks. On September 15, 1916, at the Battle of Flers-Courcelette, the Mark I tank rolled onto the battlefield. This machine was a terrifying, clanking, smoking monster. But let's look at the engineering inside because it was primitive and brutal. 1. The shape, the rhomboid. Notice the weird parallelogram shape. It wasn't for style, it was pure geometry. The main obstacle was the trench. A standard car would fall nose first into a 6-foot trench and get stuck. The Mark I's tracks went all the way around the body. The high, upswept nose allowed it to climb a 5-foot parapet, while the long tail prevented it from tipping backward. 2. The steering, a nightmare. Driving a modern tank is like driving a car. Driving a Mark I was a team sport. It took 4 men just to steer it. The commander operated the brakes. The driver operated the primary gearbox and throttle. 2 gearsmen, located in the back, sitting on small stools. To turn left, the commander signalled. The left gearsman would disengage his track. The right gearsman would engage his track. The driver would throttle up. The tank would lurch left. The noise was so deafening, there was no muffler, that they couldn't hear voice commands. They communicated by hitting the engine block with a hammer or using hand signals. 3. The environment. Inside the tank, the engine, a huge 105 horsepower Daimler, sat right in the middle of the crew compartment. There was no firewall. Heat. Temperatures regularly reached 122 degrees Fahrenheit, 50 degrees Celsius. Fumes, the exhaust system was leaky. Carbon monoxide, CO, filled the cabin. Also, when the guns fired, cordite fumes, propellant, built up. Sickness. Crews didn't just get shot, they passed out from fumes or vomited from the motion sickness. The tank rocked violently over shell holes. 4. The variants. There were 2 types. Male, armed with 2 6-pounder naval cannons for destroying bunkers. Female, armed with heavy Vickers machine guns for killing infantry. The debut performance. Of the 49 tanks shipped to the Somme, only 32 made it to the start line. The rest broke down mechanically. Of those, only 9 made it across no man's land. Mechanically, they were a failure. They were too slow, 3 miles per hour max. They broke down constantly, and if a German shell hit them, the spalling, flakes of metal flying off the inside of the armor, would kill the crew, even if the shell didn't penetrate. But psychologically, they were a game changer. Imagine being a German soldier. You haven't slept in 3 days. Suddenly, out of the fog, a house-sized iron monster crawls over your trench, crushing your barbed wire like spaghetti, and bullets just bounce off it. Panic ensued. German soldiers ran. For the first time, the Allies had a key to unlock the deadlock. The tank wasn't perfect yet, but the age of the horse was over. The age of armoured warfare had begun. As 1916 ended, the war had evolved from a contest of armies into a contest of industries. Germany was killing efficiently, but they were starving. The British naval blockade was strangling the German economy, and across the ocean a sleeping giant was watching the carnage with growing concern. The United States was about to step onto the stage. While the armies were stuck in the mud of France, a different kind of war was happening above the clouds and beneath the waves. This was a war of high technology, where the environment itself, the thin air, and the crushing pressure of the deep was just as dangerous as the enemy. Let's look up first. The Knights of the Sky, the birth of air combat. In 1914, the airplane was barely a teenager. The Wright brothers had flown just 11 years earlier. When the war started, generals thought planes were useless toys. may be good for spotting artillery or seeing where the enemy was marching, but certainly not for fighting. Pilots were gentlemen. They waved at each other. Sometimes they threw bricks or oranges at enemy planes. Then someone brought a pistol, then a rifle, and suddenly the sky became a battlefield, but the planes themselves were primitive. We are talking about biplanes, aircraft, with two stacked wings. The physics of the biplane, why two wings? It comes down to material science. In 1914, we didn't have light, strong aluminum alloys. We had wood, spruce, canvas, linen, and wire. If you built a single long wing, monoplane, out of wood, it would snap under the G-forces of a turn. By stacking two shorter wings and connecting them with struts and wires, you created a truss structure like a box kite or a bridge. This was incredibly strong and rigid. However, there was a trade-off: drag. Two wings mean double the leading edge resistance. The wires vibrated in the wind, creating turbulent airflow. This meant WWI planes were slow, most topped out at 100 to 120 miles per hour. But they were incredibly agile. They could turn on a dime, which led to the chaotic dogfights we see in movies. The engineering problem: how to shoot. To shoot down another plane, you need a machine gun. Ideally, you want to mount it right in front of the pilot so he can aim the whole plane at the enemy. But there is a spinning propeller in the way. If you fire a machine gun through a propeller, you will shoot your own blades off. The Allies tried mounting guns on the top wing, the Foster mounting, but reloading was a nightmare. The French pilot Roland Garros tried bolting steel deflector plates onto his propeller blades. If a bullet hit the blade, it bounced off. Dangerous, but it worked, until he crashed behind German lines. The Germans captured his plane, looked at the crude steel plates, and gave the problem to their genius engineer, Anthony Fokker. Fokker created the synchronization gear, or interrupter gear. The mechanics. This is a masterpiece of timing. A cam is attached to the propeller shaft. A linkage connects the cam to the trigger of the machine gun. The pilot pulls the trigger, but the gun doesn't fire immediately. The gun only fires when the cam signals that the propeller blade is out of the way. Essentially, the propeller is pulling the trigger for you. It allowed the pilot to fire 500 rounds a minute directly through the spinning arc of the blades without hitting a single one. This gave birth to the Fokker scourge of 1915, where German monoplanes slaughtered Allied aircraft. It also gave rise to the ace, pilots like the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen, who shot down 80 planes. He painted his plane bright red not to hide, but to terrify. But life as a pilot was short. The average life expectancy of a new pilot in 1917 was about 11 days. They had no parachutes. Generals thought parachutes would encourage cowardice. If your plane caught fire, which happened often because they were made of wood, fabric, and highly flammable dope varnish, you had two choices: burn to death or jump. The iron castles, the war at sea. While the planes were small and fragile, the war at sea was defined by the largest moving objects ever built by human hands: the dreadnoughts. A dreadnought battleship was a floating city. It carried 1,000 men. It was clad in 12 inches of hardened steel armor, and it carried massive 15-inch guns that could fire a shell weighing as much as a small car, 1,900 pounds, over a distance of 15 miles. The physics of naval gunnery, hitting a moving target from a moving platform 15 miles away, is a calculus nightmare. You have to account for ballistics. The shell goes up into the stratosphere and comes down. It takes about 60 seconds to arrive. Relative motion, your ship is moving, the target is moving. Coriolis effect. The rotation of the Earth actually curves the path of the shell over that distance. The British and Germans built massive mechanical computers, analog fire control tables, to solve these equations in real time. For most of the war, the British Royal Navy, the Grand Fleet, and the German Navy, the High Seas Fleet, just stared at each other across the North Sea. The British had more ships. If Germany tried to break out, they would lose. So the British successfully blockaded Germany. This is crucial. The blockade starved Germany of food and fertilizer, nitrates. It was a slow strangulation that killed hundreds of thousands of German civilians. The only time the two giants actually fought was the Battle of Jutland on May 31st, 1916. It was the largest naval battle in history up to that point. 250 ships clashed off the coast of Denmark. The result was confusing. Tactically, the Germans won. Their ships were better designed. They had better rangefinders and safer handling of cordite, propellant. Several British battle cruisers simply exploded because a German shell hit a turret, and the flash fire travelled down the ammunition hoist into the magazine. The HMS Indefatigable and HMS Queen Mary vanished in massive fireballs, killing thousands in seconds. Strategically, however, the British won. Why? Because the next day the German fleet limped back to port and never came out again. The British blockade remained. The German surface navy was effectively in jail. The wolves of the deep, U-boat warfare. Since Germany couldn't win on the surface, they went underwater. This brings us to the U-boat, Unterseeboot. Submarines in 1914 weren't like modern nuclear subs. They were essentially surface torpedo boats that could duck underwater for short periods. Shutterstock. The physics of diving, buoyancy. How does a 500-ton steel tube sink and then float again? It uses Archimedes' principle. A U-boat has a double hull. The space between the inner and outer hull is the ballast tank. To dive, the captain opens the vents on top of the tanks. Air escapes and water floods in from the bottom. The boat becomes heavier than the water it displaces. Negative buoyancy, it sinks. To surface. The crew releases compressed air from storage bottles into the tanks. The air pressure forces the water out. The boat becomes lighter. Positive buoyancy, it rises. The limitations, underwater. U-boats ran on electric batteries. These were heavy, weak, and short-lived. A U-boat could only stay submerged for a few hours at a slow crawl, 4 to 5 knots. If they went too fast, the batteries drained in an hour. On the surface, they ran on loud, smoky diesel engines to recharge the batteries and travel fast, 15 knots. This meant U-boats spent 90% of their time on the surface. They only dove to attack or hide. The strategy: unrestricted submarine warfare. Germany realized that Britain was an island. It relied on imports for everything. If U-boats could sink enough merchant ships, Britain would starve in 6 weeks. So they declared the waters around Britain a war zone. Any ship, military or civilian, enemy or neutral, would be torpedoed without warning. The weapon, the torpedo. A torpedo is a self-propelled mini-submarine. It has a propeller, a rudder, and a warhead. The guidance system was a masterpiece of Victorian engineering. The gyroscope, a spinning flywheel inside the torpedo, kept it stable. If the torpedo drifted left, the gyro stayed straight, triggering a lever that turned the rudder right to correct the course. In May 1915, a U-boat captain named Walter Schwieger spotted a massive four-stack ocean liner off the coast of Ireland. It was the RMS Lusitania. He fired one torpedo. It hit the starboard side. Then a second, massive explosion ripped the ship apart. Historians still debate if this was coal dust or illicit ammunition in the cargo. The Lusitania sank in 18 minutes. 1,198 people died, including 128 Americans. The sinking of the Lusitania was a PR disaster for Germany. It turned American public opinion from neutral to angry. Germany paused the unrestricted attacks for a while to keep the US out of the war, but by 1917 Germany was desperate. They gambled. They calculated that if they restarted unrestricted submarine warfare, they could starve Britain before the slow-moving Americans could get an army across the Atlantic. It was a cold, calculated risk, and it was the mistake that would cost them the war. By 1917, the war had been raging for 3 years. The short war illusion was a distant memory. The attrition strategy of 1916 had failed to produce a winner. It had only produced graveyards. Now the strain was becoming too much for the combatants to bear. In engineering terms, when you apply stress to a material for too long, it reaches its yield point, it deforms, and then it snaps. In 1917, one giant snapped and another giant woke up. The collapse of the Russian colossus Russia was the first to break. But it wasn't German bullets that killed the Russian Empire. It was thermodynamics and logistics. Russia is big. In 1914, it covered 1/6 of the Earth's land surface. But its infrastructure was medieval. The entire empire relied on a single, fragile, circulatory system, the railways. Here is the engineering problem. Russia's food is grown in the south, Ukraine. Russia's industry and population centers, Petrograd and Moscow, are in the north. The war is in the west. The railway network had to move soldiers and ammunition to the front and food to the cities. It couldn't do both. The trains were single-track lines. Engines broke down and weren't repaired because the mechanics were drafted into the infantry. By the winter of 1916 to 1917, the system seized up. In Petrograd, modern St. Petersburg, the temperature dropped to -30 degrees Fahrenheit. The trains carrying coal and flour were stuck in snowdrifts hundreds of miles away. Bakeries ran out of fuel to heat their ovens. The calorie intake of the average Russian worker dropped by 50%. Hunger does something to the human brain. It overrides fear. On March 8, 1917, February 23rd in the Russian calendar, women standing in bread lines had had enough. They started smashing shop windows. They weren't calling for a political revolution. They were calling for bread. The Tsar, Nicholas II, ordered the army to shoot the protesters. But the soldiers were hungry too. They were peasants who had seen their families starve. Instead of shooting the women, they shot their officers. Within days, the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty collapsed. Nicholas II abdicated. A provisional government took over, but they made a fatal mistake. They kept fighting the war. They felt honor-bound to their allies, France and Britain. Germany saw an opportunity to knock Russia out completely. They decided to use a biological weapon, not a virus, but an idea. They found a radical Russian exile living in Switzerland named Vladimir Lenin. Lenin wanted to stop the war and start a communist revolution. The Germans put Lenin and 31 other revolutionaries on a train. It was a sealed train, literally locked, so they couldn't get off and infect Germany with their ideas. They transported this virus across Germany through Sweden and injected it into Petrograd at Finland Station. It worked. By October, Lenin had seized power. His first act? The Decree on Peace. Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and walked away from the war. Germany had won the Eastern Front. They could now move millions of soldiers to the west to crush France and Britain. But just as Russia was leaving, someone else was arriving. The Zimmerman telegram, the code that changed history. The United States had been neutral since 1914. President Woodrow Wilson won re-election in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." Americans were making a fortune selling supplies to the Allies, but they had no desire to die in French mud. Germany wanted to keep it that way, but they also wanted to restart unrestricted submarine warfare to starve Britain. They knew this would make the US angry. So the German Foreign Minister, Arthur Zimmerman, came up with a plan to distract the US. He sent a top-secret coded telegram to the German ambassador in Mexico. The message read, "We intend to begin on the 1st of February unrestricted submarine warfare. We shall endeavor in spite of this to keep the United States of America neutral. In the event of this not succeeding, we make Mexico a proposal of alliance, make war together, make peace together, and an understanding on our part that Mexico is to reconquer the lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Essentially, Mexico, please attack America so they are too busy to come to Europe." But Zimmerman made a technical error. He sent the message via telegraph cables that passed through London. And in London, in a nondescript building called the Old Admiralty, was Room 40. Room 40 was the British code-breaking unit. They were a mix of linguists, classical scholars, and puzzle solvers. They had intercepted the message, but it was encrypted using a code called 0075. Here is how 0075 worked. It was a two-part code. The telegram was just a string of numbers, 1304 216 78 92 2001. You needed a code book to translate 13,042 into Mexico. The British had acquired, stolen, a German code book earlier in the war from a wrecked cruiser in the Baltic. Nigel de Grey, a Room 40 cryptanalyst, sat down and deciphered the message. When he saw the words Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, he knew he held dynamite. But there was a problem. If Britain showed the telegram to the US, Germany would know their code was broken and would change it. Also, Britain would have to admit they were tapping American cables too, which they were. So they devised a cover story. They knew the German ambassador in Washington had forwarded the message to Mexico City via Western Union. The British had a spy in the Mexico City telegraph office steal the decoded copy that was handed to the German ambassador there. On February 24, 1917, the British handed the telegram to President Wilson. When it hit the American newspapers, the public exploded. The idea of Germany carving up Texas was an invasion of the American homeland. Combined with the sinking of American merchant ships by U-boats, the camel's back was broken. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. The Atlantic Bridge, a logistics miracle. Declaring war is easy. Fighting it is hard. In 1917, the US Army was tiny. It had only about 130,000 men, smaller than the Army of Portugal. It had almost no heavy artillery, no tanks, and no combat planes. The Germans laughed. They called the American army a zero. They calculated it would take America 2 years to build an army and ship it across the ocean. By then, the war would be over. They were wrong about American industrial speed. 1. The draft. Selective service. The US didn't rely on volunteers. They assigned every man a number. On July 20th, 1917, the Secretary of War pulled numbers out of a glass bowl in Washington. Within months, the US Army grew to 4 million men. 2. The bridge of ships. How do you move 2 million men and millions of tons of supplies across an ocean filled with U-boats? At first, it was a disaster. U-boats were sinking 800,000 tons of Allied shipping per month. Britain was 6 weeks away from starvation. The solution was the convoy system. The British Admiralty had resisted convoys, groups of ships protected by warships. They thought a large group was a bigger target, but the math proved them wrong. The ocean is huge. Scenario A, 100 single ships scattered randomly. A U-boat has 100 chances to spot a smokestack on the horizon. Scenario B, one massive group of 100 ships. A U-boat has only one chance to spot the group. If it misses that one chance, 100 ships get through safely. It's a probability game. Once the convoy system was adopted, shipping losses dropped by 90%. 3. Dazzle camouflage. To further confuse the U-boats, the Allies painted their ships in bizarre cubist art patterns called dazzle camouflage. Normal camouflage tries to hide you. Dazzle camouflage tries to confuse the eye. U-boats needed to calculate a ship's speed and heading to fire a torpedo. The jagged stripes and contrasting colors of dazzle broke up the ship's outline. Looking through a periscope, a U-boat captain couldn't tell which way the ship was pointing or how big it was. It was an optical illusion weaponized. By the summer of 1917, the first American troops, the doughboys, arrived in France. They were green. They were inexperienced. They refused to listen to French advice about trench warfare. They wanted to charge in the open, but they had something the Europeans had lost years ago: optimism. And more importantly, they were well fed. General John J. Pershing, the American commander, famously visited the tomb of the Marquis de Lafayette, the French hero of the American Revolution, and announced, "Lafayette, we are here." The balance had shifted. Russia was out, but America was in. Now it was a race. Germany had one last chance. They had moved 50 divisions from the Russian front to the west. They had millions of men ready for one final massive punch. They had to win the war before the millions of Americans finished their training. The stage was set for the final showdown of 1918. The Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's battle. The year is 1918. The war has been a stalemate for 4 years. The map of the Western Front has barely changed since 1914, but now the clock is ticking louder than the artillery. Germany is in a race against time. The United States has entered the war. Every day, 10,000 fresh American soldiers arrive in France. They are inexperienced, yes, but they are healthy, well-fed, and armed with the unlimited industrial might of the New World. Germany knows it cannot win a long war against the combined economies of the world. They need to win now before the American army is fully trained. So, on March 21st, 1918, Germany launches its final gamble, the spring offensive, the Kaiserschlacht. The stormtroopers, changing the physics of assault. For years, the tactic was simple: the wave. You blow a whistle, thousands of men stand up in a line, and they walk toward the enemy. The enemy machine guns mow them down. It was a geometry problem, a line moving against a point. The point always won. The Germans realized they needed to change the geometry. They invented infiltration tactics. Instead of a wave, think of water. When you pour water on a hill, it doesn't push the rocks out of the way, it flows around them. The Germans created elite units called stormtroopers, Stoßtruppen. These men were not average conscripts. They were young, fit, and heavily armed. They didn't carry heavy packs or rifles. They carried bags of grenades, sharpened shovels, and a terrifying new weapon, the flamethrower, Flammenwerfer. The mechanism of the attack, hurricane bombardment. Instead of shelling for a week, which warns the enemy, the German artillery fired a short, intense hurricane of gas and high explosives for just a few hours. This stunned the defenders but didn't churn up the ground so much that the attackers couldn't run. Bypass the hard points. If the stormtroopers hit a machine gun nest that was fighting back, they didn't charge it. They ignored it. They ran past it, deeper into the enemy lines. Cut the brain. Their goal was to destroy the headquarters and telephone lines in the rear. Once the front-line soldiers lost contact with their commanders, panic set in. The strong points, now surrounded and leaderless, would surrender to the regular infantry following behind. To aid this speed, the Germans introduced the first true submachine gun, the MP-18. Before this, automatic weapons were heavy and static. The MP-18 was handheld. It fired 9mm pistol rounds at 500 rounds per minute. For clearing a trench, it was a broom of lead. The tactic worked. The Germans smashed through the British lines. They advanced 40 miles, the biggest movement since 1914. Panic spread in Paris. The British commander, General Haig, issued his famous backs-to-the-wall order, telling his men to die where they stood rather than retreat further. But then logistics killed the German offensive. The stormtroopers were moving so fast that their supply wagons, pulled by starving horses, couldn't keep up. The soldiers were exhausted. When they captured British supply depots, they stopped fighting to eat. They found white bread, canned beef, and wine, luxuries they hadn't seen in years. The offensive literally ate itself to a halt. By July 1918, the German energy was spent. They had used their best men. Now it was the Allies' turn. The 100 Days Offensive, the symphony of destruction. The Allied counterattack, starting on August 8, 1918, the Battle of Amiens, wasn't just an attack. It was the birth of modern combined arms warfare. In previous years, tanks, artillery, and infantry fought separate battles. Now they were instruments in a single orchestra. 1. The science of sound ranging. The Allies had a secret weapon, and it wasn't a gun, it was a microphone. German artillery was deadly. To destroy it, you had to know where it was. But the guns were hidden behind hills, miles away. The Allies set up arrays of microphones along the front line. When a German gun fired, the sound wave hit microphone A, then microphone B, then microphone C. By measuring the tiny time differences in milliseconds between when the sound hit each microphone and knowing the speed of sound adjusted for wind and temperature, they could triangulate the exact position of the enemy gun. Within minutes, Allied artillery could drop a shell right down the barrel of a German gun that no one had ever seen. 2. The creeping barrage, perfected. Instead of just bombing the enemy trenches, the artillery fired a moving wall of shrapnel. The curtain of fire moved forward 100 yards every 3 minutes. The infantry followed just 50 yards behind the explosions. It was terrifyingly dangerous. If you walked too fast, your own artillery killed you. If you walked too slow, the enemy machine gunners had time to come out of their dugouts. But when it worked, the infantry arrived at the enemy trench exactly as the shell fire lifted, catching the Germans while they were still keeping their heads down. 3. The mechanical cavalry. The British introduced the Mark V tank. It was faster and more reliable than the Mark I, but they also brought the Whippet tank. The Whippet was smaller, faster, 8 miles per hour, and armed with machine guns. If the heavy tanks were the battering ram, the Whippets were the cavalry. They raced through the holes in the line and terrorized the German rear areas. 4. Air superiority. The sky was black with Allied planes. They didn't just dogfight, they performed close air support. They flew low, strafing German trenches and dropping small bombs on anti-tank guns. On August 8th, the German lines collapsed. It was, in the words of General Ludendorff, the Black Day of the German army. Whole German divisions surrendered without firing a shot. They were done. They knew they couldn't stop this mechanical juggernaut. The collapse from within. The end of the war didn't happen because the Allies marched into Berlin. In fact, not a single Allied soldier set foot on German soil until after the surrender. Germany collapsed from the inside out. The primary cause was the blockade. For 4 years, the Royal Navy had strangled Germany. Nitrates. Germany needed nitrates for explosives and fertilizer. They chose explosives. The turnip winter. By 1917, the potato crop had failed. Civilians were eating turnips, cattle fodder. Bread was made with sawdust to bulk it up. Starvation. It is estimated that nearly 760,000 German civilians died of malnutrition and disease caused by the blockade. The German people were watching their children starve while the Kaiser promised victory. When the spring offensive failed, the illusion shattered. The spark of revolution started, ironically, in the Navy. On October 29, 1918, the German High Command ordered the High Seas Fleet to sail out for one last honourable suicide battle against the British Navy. The sailors in the port of Kiel said no. They knew the war was lost. Why die for nothing? They mutinied. They seized the ships. The revolt spread to the workers in the cities. Germany was dissolving into civil war. Councils of workers and soldiers, similar to the Soviets in Russia, were taking over cities. The Kaiser, Wilhelm II, was at army headquarters in Spa, Belgium. His generals told him the truth. "Sire, the army will not fight for you any more." On November 9th, 1918, the Kaiser abdicated. He got on a train and fled to the Netherlands, where he would live out the rest of his life in exile, chopping wood. A new government, a republic, was declared in Berlin. Their first and only job was to end the war immediately. The railway car in the forest. On November 8, 1918, a German delegation crossed the front lines. They were driven to a secret location in the forest of Compiègne, France. Waiting for them on a railway siding was the personal train carriage of the Allied Supreme Commander, Ferdinand Foch. The atmosphere was freezing cold, both physically and emotionally. Foch didn't shake hands, he didn't offer coffee, he simply handed them a paper. It wasn't a peace treaty. It was an armistice, a ceasefire. The terms were humiliating. Germany must hand over all its submarines. Germany must hand over 5,000 artillery pieces, 25,000 machine guns, and 1,700 airplanes. Germany must evacuate all occupied territory within 14 days. The blockade would continue until a final treaty was signed. The German delegate, Matthias Erzberger, was horrified. He pleaded, "This will leave us defenseless against the Bolsheviks. We have a revolution at home." Foch replied, "That is your problem." Erzberger had no choice. Germany was starving. The army was dissolving. He signed. The time was set for the ceasefire to begin, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. 11 a.m., November the 11th, 1918. You would think the fighting would stop immediately. It didn't. In a tragic display of human stubbornness, some commanders ordered attacks right up until 10:59 a.m. They wanted to capture one last village or just punish the Hun one last time. The last American killed was Henry Gunther. At 10:59 a.m., 1 minute before peace, he charged a German machine gun nest. The Germans, knowing the war was over in 60 seconds, actually waved him back. They yelled at him to stop. Gunther kept running and firing. The Germans reluctantly shot him. He died instantly. 1 minute later, the guns fell silent. After 4 years of the loudest, most constant noise in human history, a terrifying silence fell over the Western Front. Men climbed out of the trenches. They didn't cheer. They just stood there, stunned. The birds, which had fled the zone years ago, started to sing. The war to end. All wars was over. But the dying wasn't. Because as the soldiers packed up to go home, they were carrying something in their lungs that would kill more people than all the machine guns combined. The guns fell silent on November 11th, 1918. The soldiers cheered, believing the killing was over. They were wrong. As they packed into crowded trains and ships to return to their families, they were carrying a biological time bomb in their lungs. The war had killed about 10 million soldiers. The thing coming next would kill 50 to 100 million people. It was called the Spanish flu, the biological storm, H1N1. First, a correction, it wasn't Spanish. Spain was a neutral country during the war. Their newspapers were free to report on the illness, while the warring nations, Britain, France, Germany, USA, censored the news to keep morale high. Because Spain was the only one talking about it, the world assumed it started there. In reality, patient zero was likely a cook at a military base in Kansas, USA. The virology, this was an H1N1 influenza A virus. But it wasn't your average seasonal flu. Seasonal flu usually kills the very young, weak immune systems, and the very old, failing immune systems. The 1918 flu killed the strongest. It targeted people aged 20 to 40, the prime of life. The cytokine storm. Why did it kill the healthy? The virus triggered an overreaction of the body's immune system called a cytokine storm. When the virus attacked the lungs, the immune system sent too many white blood cells and fluid to fight it. The lungs filled with fluid. The victim didn't die from the virus itself. They drowned in their own immune response. Because young, healthy adults had the strongest immune systems, they had the strongest and deadliest reaction. Doctors reported seeing patients turn blue, cyanosis, from lack of oxygen hours before they died. The global vector. The war created the perfect laboratory for a pandemic. Concentration. Millions of men lived in muddy, cramped trenches, sharing food, water, and air. Movement. These men were then put on ships and trains, traveling to every corner of the globe: India, Africa, Australia, America. Stress. Malnutrition and stress weaken their bodies, making them susceptible. In Philadelphia, a parade to support the war effort, Liberty Loan Parade, brought 200,000 people together. Within days, the city's hospitals collapsed. They ran out of coffins. Priests drove horse-drawn carts down the streets, calling, "Bring out your dead," like it was the medieval plague. It killed more people in 24 weeks than AIDS killed in 24 years. It killed more American soldiers than the Germans did. And just as mysteriously as it appeared, it mutated into a less deadly strain and vanished in 1920. The Treaty of Versailles, the peace to end all peace. While the world was coughing, the leaders of the victorious nations met in Paris in 1919 to decide the fate of the losers. This was the Paris Peace Conference. The big three dominated the room: Woodrow Wilson, USA, the idealist. He wanted a peace without victory. He proposed the 14 points, including the League of Nations, a precursor to the UN, to prevent future wars. David Lloyd George, Britain, the pragmatist. He wanted Germany to pay, but not so much that they couldn't trade with Britain. Georges Clemenceau, France, the avenger. He had seen Germany invade France twice in his lifetime. He wanted Germany destroyed. He wanted them broken so badly they could never hold a rifle again. Clemenceau won. On June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years to the day after the assassination in Sarajevo, the German delegation was brought into the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. They were forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles, the redrawing of the map. The treaty took a pair of scissors to the globe. 4 empires vanished overnight. The Ottoman Empire, carved up by Britain and France, and they drew straight lines in the sand to create new countries like Iraq, Syria, and Palestine, ignoring the ethnic and religious tribes living there. This created the modern Middle East conflicts. Austria-Hungary smashed into pieces. Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia were born. Russia lost huge territories: Poland, Finland, the Baltics. Germany lost 13% of its European territory and all of its overseas colonies. But the territory wasn't the main issue. The poison pill was Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. It forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for causing the war. Because they were guilty, they had to pay for the damage. The reparations were set at 132 billion gold marks, about $442 billion today. The economic consequence: John Maynard Keynes, the famous economist present at the conference, walked out in disgust. He predicted that this amount was impossible to pay. He warned that if you starve Germany, you will create a monster. He was right. To pay the debt, Germany printed money. This led to hyperinflation in 1923. A loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. People burned money for heat because it was cheaper than wood. The middle class was wiped out. Their savings became worthless dust. The seeds of World War II, the Treaty of Versailles, didn't create peace. It created resentment. It humiliated a proud nation. Germany felt stabbed in the back. They hadn't been invaded. Their army had marched home in good order. They felt betrayed by the politicians who signed the Armistice, the November criminals. In this chaos of starvation, humiliation, and economic ruin, a disgruntled Austrian corporal, who had been temporarily blinded by British gas in 1918, sat in a Munich beer hall. He listened to the angry men around him. He told them it wasn't their fault. He told them they were betrayed by Jews and communists. He told them He could make Germany great again. His name was Adolf Hitler. The Treaty of Versailles was supposed to ensure that Germany could never start another war. Instead, by crushing them so completely, it virtually guaranteed that they would try. As Marshal Ferdinand Foch, the Allied Supreme Commander, looked at the treaty, he famously said, "This is not peace, it is an armistice for 20 years. He missed his prediction by only 65 days. The First World War solved nothing. It merely paused the conflict, leaving the underlying issues to fester and rot, until they would explode again with even greater violence in 1939. So what was the cost of all this? If you were to stand at the cenotaph in London and watch a parade of the Dead March past, 4 abreast, it would take 4 days just for the British Empire's dead to pass. If you included all the combatants, French, German, Russian, Austrian, American, Ottoman, the parade would last for 6 weeks. In total, World War I claimed roughly 20 million lives. That is 9.7 million soldiers and 10 million civilians. Another 21 million were wounded, many maimed for life with missing limbs or faces destroyed by shrapnel. But numbers are cold. The real tragedy was the lost generation. It wasn't just that they died, it was who died. The poets, the scientists, the fathers, the artists. Europe committed suicide. It destroyed its own youth. The survivors came home to a world that didn't understand them. They were silent. They couldn't explain the mud, the gas, or the screams to people who had stayed home. The war also shattered the illusion of civilization. Before 1914, people believed technology was making the world better. The war proved that technology just made murder more efficient. We learned that a man with a machine gun is not more civilized than a man with a sword. He is just more dangerous. 4 great empires, German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman and Russian, vanished. The maps were redrawn. The seeds of bitterness were planted in Germany, in the Middle East, and in Russia, seeds that would grow into the horrors of the 20th century, fascism, communism, and the Holocaust. The war to end all wars didn't end war. It just started the clock for the next one. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the trenches. If you want to understand how this unfinished business exploded into World War II, make sure you are subscribed. Let me know in the comments. Do you think World War I was inevitable, or was it a mistake that could have been avoided? I'll see you in the next one.